the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Going to spend some time today talking about Adam and Eve, and this is not a small issue indeed. A number of years ago, when I was the president of the International Society of Christian Apologetics, we did an entire conference on, do we believe in a historic Adam? Because if you don't, then it changes everything in terms of your perspective about the Bible, about theology. Some people want to say, well, I only believe what Jesus has to say. Well, Jesus talked about a historic Adam and Eve and about a Noah and a Jonah. And Paul talks about an Adam. And yet some people say, well, we believe in theistic evolution. And so there wasn't just an Adam, but there was sort of an Adam-like individual that eventually evolved into a human being. So it's not a small issue, and that's why we're going to spend an entire hour today working our way through this new book, Searching for Adam, Genesis and the Truth About Man's Origin. Now, we're not just going to look at that. We're going to look at the issue of human anatomy and some of the things which show that human beings are unique from other animals. And we're certainly going to spend some time talking about how this relates to Scripture and science. So I think you really want to kind of sit back and listen. But a little bit later, we'll give you a chance to ask questions as we open up the phones. Dr. Terry Mortenson is with us. He earned a Master of Divinity from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and a PhD in the history of geology. He also has lectured on this creation-evolution controversy in 25 different countries. Before he actually joined with Answers in Genesis back in 2001, he spent 26 years with a group called Campus Crusade for Christ, which you're very familiar with. And he brings just a wealth of information to this and is the editor of a series of essays here that I think are going to really help you understand this issue of Adam. So, Dr. Mortenson, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Good to be with you, Kerby.
I appreciate the good work that you've done. This was a monumental task, wasn't it, to bring together the different writings, the footnotes, and all of this. It's a very significant book. And if you would maybe indulge me for just a minute, talk about why it's so significant for people to know about a book that's 500 pages written by all these different scholars.
Well, I think in your introduction to the program today, you made it very clear that Adam is really foundational to the gospel. And one of the things I mentioned in the book, we're using quotes from evolutionists over the last 120 years, is they really see clearly that without a literal Adam and a literal fall, the gospel collapses. So it's really critical. And I just felt there was a need for a wide-ranging book that addressed this from different angles by men who are really expert in those issues.
And even though you didn't write all the chapters, I think you can probably address some of those. So let's start with the Old Testament. First of all, you have theological background, so certainly that is the case. But when we look at that, we have quite a bit of evidence for a literal belief in a historic Adam and Eve, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. There's good reason to conclude that Genesis 1 to 11 is historical narrative. As many readers will understand, there are different genres of Scripture. There's poetry and parable and prophetic visions, but Genesis has all the marks of historical narrative. And when we really look carefully at the details, it's clear that Genesis is describing a real man and a real woman in a real garden. And so Dr. Barrick, who wrote the first chapter, really unpacks all of that. And one verse that really is critical, well, actually two, the description of the creation of Adam and the one of Eve. Adam was, it says, God made man from the dust of the earth. He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being or a living creature. The text does not say God made a living creature, breathed into it, and that became man.
Yeah.
The text is perfectly clear. And then with Eve, of course, she was made from a living creature, Adam, but verse 22 is describing supernatural surgery. There's no way you can harmonize either of those verses with evolution.
I would think so. One other point, just before we move on to the New Testament, is that some people, it was well-meaning, but it's, I think, flawed to try to protect the book of Genesis by saying, well, maybe the first 11 chapters are more like a metaphor or an allegory, and then the rest it looks more historical, because lots of people will say, oh, I believe there was a Moses and an Abraham, but I do have some problems with whether or not there was a Noah, a flood, and whether there's an Adam. Can we make that distinction between the first 11 chapters of Genesis and the rest of Genesis?
I don't think so at all. Again, as you alluded in your opening comments, both Jesus and Paul, and we could add Peter, whenever they refer to those first 11 chapters, they take it as straightforward history. And furthermore, chapter 11 ends with Abraham, and chapter 12 begins with Abraham. So there's no break in the narrative. And then you have a Hebrew word, toledot, that appears 11 times in Genesis, tying the whole book together. It's translated in English, these are the generations of, or this is the account of. And 3 of those, or 4 of those toledots are in the first 11 chapters. So it ties the whole book together as a historical account.
Let's, if we can, move on to the New Testament, and we've already sort of talked about Paul, but a lot of people will say, we've got a problem here because he's referring to the first Adam and then the second Adam. So whether you look at Romans 5, you look at 1 Corinthians 15, you look at a lot of passages, he tends to really bring those two together. And if there's a second Adam, which is Jesus, it would seem to imply, maybe I'm just being too simplistic, that there was a first Adam who really was a historical feature and a historical person, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And then we look at the genealogy of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, and he traces that lineage all the way back through David and Abraham to Adam. So if any person in that genealogical list is not a real person, then Jesus is descended from a metaphor, and that destroys his true humanity. So it's critical that we have a historical Adam. And Jesus himself, in Mark chapter 10, when he was asked a question about divorce by the Pharisees, said, have you not read? Go back to the beginning of Genesis. And he quotes from Genesis 1 and 2, God created marriage as a man and a woman for life. And Jesus takes that historical fact as his foundation for his teaching on marriage.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Terry Mortenson. The book is entitled Searching for Adam, Genesis and the Truth About Man's Origin. It's one of the master books, which we've talked about before. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link so that you can order it if you'd like to get it immediately. And as you do that, of course, it's available both in paperback and in Kindle. And we also, of course, have a link to answersingenesis.org, so you can order it there as well. I've tried to make it very easy for you to get a copy of this. And as we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about why this has become so important, why individuals, oftentimes identifying themselves as evangelicals, say, well, maybe we don't really need to believe in historic Adam, and hence the reason for this book, and hence the reason for talking about it today here on Point of View, and also talk about maybe why did it disappear. Eugene Merrow has written a very good piece in here about Where Are You, Adam?, the disappearance of Adam and the death of truth. And then we'll get into some of the arguments for the distinctions between humans and animals. So we've got a lot to cover, and we'll do so right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Sometimes the most important principles of a news story are the ones rarely mentioned. When we compare the death of Alfie Evans to Charlie Gard, we see the loss of parental control. And when we contrast his situation to the royal prince, we see the danger of socialized medicine. Over a week ago, the news dutifully reported that young Alfie Evans died because his parents were denied the opportunity to obtain treatment in Italy. Last year, it was Charlie Gard who was taken off life support by the British court system and prevented from seeking medical treatment in America. These two cases will become the precedent that confirms that the state, not the parents, have control of sick children. The British court system removed parental control and placed it in the hands of British bureaucrats. It is one thing when a government steps in when parents prevent children from receiving life-saving treatment. It is quite another when the government prevents parents from pursuing life-saving treatment for their child. Considering the contrast of the death of Alfie Evans with the birth of the prince. If the prince were born with some medical condition, don't you think that the royal family would do anything they could to save the child? It is hard to imagine the British court system getting involved at all. His treatment would be the exception. Alfie Evans and Charlie Gard are the rule. Sick children in a socialized medical system cannot be allowed to leave. Others might be ready to leave the system, and that would damage the system. And if any one of these sick children were cured, it would reflect badly on the medical experts and the British bureaucrats. So parents cannot be allowed to take their children to another country, even if the parents or the other country pay for it. During this political season, various candidates are talking about further government control of health care. We need to ask them if the stories of sick children in England illustrate what they're advocating for America. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Terry Mortenson, and we'll be talking about his book, Searching for Adam, Genesis and the Truth About Man's Origin. And if you'd like to join our conversation a bit later, we'll open up the phones. But Terry, I thought for just a minute we might move to chapter 4 in the book, the whole question about the disappearance of Adam. Some of our listeners might say, okay, I'm glad you're talking about this, but I believe there's an Adam. Jesus talked about an Adam. Paul talked about an Adam. Peter talks about an Adam. The early church fathers believed in this. So what's the deal? Well, the deal is that you can go to a lot of Christian colleges. You know this only so well. And Ken Ham and I have talked about this before, where there is a belief in theistic evolution. And so then they have to figure out, well, where does Adam fit? And then, of course, you already start having theological problems, because if there's no Adam and there's no fall in Genesis 3, then why do we need a Savior? Or if there is death and killing and extinction before Adam and Eve, then that seems to be contradictory to the book of Genesis. So if you can, for a minute, talk about why we are even dealing with this. Where did we get to a situation where we felt we had to jettison and remove the idea of historic Adam?
Well, it's because obviously for over 100 years since Darwin published his Descent of Man, the scientific majority has been just hammering the culture with those famous pictures of man evolving from an ape-like creature over millions of years. And so that's been just an overwhelming influence in the culture. But also in the last, I'd say the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a growing questioning or even denial of a literal Adam by professing evangelicals. And so there have been a number of books that have come out. Just a couple of years ago, there was a debate book by Zondervan, 4 Views on the historical Adam. Only one of the writers contributing to that believed in all of the details of Genesis about a literal Adam. And then I was just at the annual meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society, which met in San Antonio this year, just before Thanksgiving. And there are 4 new books by 4 different, ostensibly evangelical publishers, all promoting evolution and millions of years. And one of those is definitely denying that Adam ever existed, that Adam is a myth. So, and another one was also arguing that Adam was mythological. So it's a serious, serious problem in the church.
I think so. Let's look at some of the theology and then the science. Now, your chapter, When Was Adam Created, really deals with that issue because we've already sort of talked a little bit about whether or not the first 11 chapters are historical, but it also brings up a major theological issue. Was there death before the fall? Because either you hold to a view that because we have death and decay and destruction, because we have physical evil as well as moral evil, that's due to the fall, Genesis 3. Or you accept that that happened before that there was earthquakes and tornadoes, and there was death, and nature red in tooth and claw. And so you have a major theological issue if you don't believe that there was a historical Adam and Eve and a historical fall, don't you?
That's exactly right. And one of the things that, one of the ideas that's very prevalent in the church today is that the only thing that really happened at the fall was that man died spiritually. But that is just not what Genesis 3 says, and it doesn't fit with what Romans chapter 8 says, which talks about the fact that the whole creation is now in bondage to corruption, waiting to be set free and liberated. And the book of Revelation, the last chapter, says that in the future, the curse that came on the creation in Genesis 3 will be removed. So this acceptance of millions of years before Adam of evolution and death and disease just destroys the whole biblical picture of creation, fall, and redemption.
Let's, if we can, get to another aspect. So we talk about the fall. Let's talk about the other pack. We so often on this program talk about the fact that human beings are created in the image of God, and so they're image bearers. If you believe in theistic evolution, then you have to say, well, somewhere one of those apes, one of those pongid apes, maybe the Neanderthals, maybe Australopithecus or something, maybe God supernaturally gave them a soul, which is difficult to say when that would take place. So don't we also, as you talk about in chapter 7, have to address Adam and this whole issue of the image of God, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. And, we see in our culture and in Europe court cases about giving the same legal rights that humans have to chimpanzees and others. Now, thinking with a biblical worldview, we would never want to advocate misuse of animals and cruel treatment of animals, but it is critical to the biblical worldview to understand that man is not simply an animal. Man is distinct and unique, and that informs our understanding of our relationship with the non-human world, as well as our view of man, of the sanctity of human life, of how we deal with people who have physical disabilities. It plays out in graphic way in what we've seen in Nazi Germany and in the eugenics movement and the whole abortion movement. So it's critical to have a real grasp of the unique image of God in man.
Again, talking with Dr. Terry Mortenson, and the book is entitled Searching for Adam, Genesis and the Truth About Man's Origin. We've looked at some of the theological issues. We'll start, just before we take a break here, looking at some of the scientific ones. And one of the questions I'm sure, Terry, people have is, well, what about these ape-like creatures? I just alluded to a few of them. Zinjanthropus, Australopithecus, Neanderthal, some of those. And in Chapter 8, there are some very helpful diagrams, which are hard to kind of show on television or even in radio, because you really have to kind of look at them in some detail. So that's why getting a copy of the book helps. But again, how about this? Because do we have fossil evidence that shows that human beings indeed evolved from these ape-like creatures?
Well, the simple answer is no. And Dr. David Menton wrote that chapter. He was for 34 years professor of human anatomy at Washington Medical School in St. Louis, and he has done extensive study on the claims of evolutionists and looked at the fossil evidence himself from the published literature. And in his chapter, he goes through, he helps lay down some basic principles to help readers when they go to the natural history museums to know what to look for to spot the deceptive artwork in comparison to the actual fossils and that kind of thing. But then he also goes through every one of the creatures that are displayed in a traveling presentation that's going to public libraries all across America promoting human evolution. And he just goes through each one of them and shows they're not really what the evolutionists are claiming. They're either fully ape or fully man or imaginary creatures.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll try to answer the question about what about Neanderthal man and Neanderthals. Marvin Lubenow, who's been on the program with us, it's been years since he's been on with us, is the author of that particular chapter. And then we'll get into some of the DNA evidence and a variety of other issues, and also talk about its implications. Because if you do believe in evolution, if you do believe in survival of the fittest, if you do believe in, as the subtitle of Origin of Species talks about, favored races, does that not lead to racism, eugenics, maybe even genocide? I think that it does. We'll talk about that. And most importantly, we want to open up the phones to give you a chance to join our conversation. That number is 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Terry Mortenson with us. He is the editor of this book and also one of the contributors to the book Searching for Adam, Genesis and the Truth About Man's Origin. We have a link to answersingenesis.org. You don't have to know how to spell it. All you have to do is click on his picture. That will take you there and find some great material that you can use based upon some of the good work at Answers in Genesis. I might also mention, as you go to the website, you're going to find a number of other resources that we want to make available to you. You can actually go back and find a couple of the interviews we've done on similar topics. My commentary today is available to you as well, and so certainly go to the website pointofview.net. Don't forget we have a video there and some other action items for you, and of course, if you would consider a gift to this ministry, we would greatly appreciate that as well. It's all available at our website, pointofview.net, so go there and take advantage of some of those resources. And when we come back, we'll continue our conversation as we look at searching for Adam, Genesis, and the truth about man's origin. Such an important topic, especially right now when the whole issue of origins is under assault. So we need to take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Terry Mortenson. All that coming up right after this.
When listeners call in, we never know what they're going to say, and sometimes they shock us, like Jacob did.
We as Christians, we should learn to support ministries like yours that is reaching out and shining light into darkness. This is why Satan has such a great grip on America and the world, is because the world support their own. They will spend billions of dollars to make sure they are heard. The Lord is working a great work through Point of View.
We are thankful for listeners like Jacob and you who become part of our family, a real part, by sacrificing to support the work of Point of View. Take Jacob's words to heart and support us today. Enable us to continue shining God's light into the darkness. We honestly cannot do it without you. Visit pointofview.net. Look for the Donate Now button or call 800-347-5151 or send a gift to Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Would you like to join our conversation? 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have with us Dr. Terry Mortenson as we talk about the book that he is the editor and contributor to, Searching for Adam, Genesis and the Truth About Man's Origins. 1-800-351-1212. Terry, let's jump over to Chapter 10 for just a minute because it relates very much to one of the questions our callers have about genetics and this idea of mitochondrial DNA. So let's go to Texas first. KAVX Clyde, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi. Several years ago, I read in a scientific journal that all mitochondrial DNA had been traced back to a woman in Africa. They said about 100,000 years ago, and I was wondering, isn't that kind of a proof of an Eve?
It is in one sense, in that it says that there weren't multiple origins to humanity, but it doesn't fit with the biblical idea. But I thought we would add to it because this chapter is fascinating, Terry, because I teach on creation, as you may know, and yet this study of human mitochondrial DNA. Now, again, we've got to explain this for just a minute. You have the DNA that is used, of course, to produce your children, and governs all sorts of different bodily functions. But then you have some DNA in your mitochondria, which is in your cell. But people have used that, and of course the secular scientists all acknowledge that there's an Eve, but they put it in quotes. They don't mean a biblical Eve. But if you look at some of the research that is documented by Nathaniel Jeeson and Jeffrey Tompkins, the prediction for evolution in terms of the DNA differences for evolution and the prediction for what a creationist would say show that the actual evidence actually seems to be a much better argument for creation rather than evolution. Explain if you might.
Well, I'm not a geneticist, so you're way ahead of me on that, and I worked really hard with these two brilliant geneticists to get this chapter to be a compelling argument for a reader that is versed in genetics, but also understandable to a person who has no expertise in that subject. So it's Nathaniel and Jeffrey are just arguing that when we really look at the evidence of the mitochondrial and mutation rates, it all points to a confirmation of the biblical view of human origins, and even the time, how long ago Adam and Eve existed.
Sure. And again, the argument, and it's a simple one, really, if you think about it. If you think of DNA as like beads on a string, if evolution is true, and we have been here for millions and millions and millions of years, then you would expect that there would be random mutations every once in a while. So some of the beads on the string would change colors, if you just want to use that as a visual illustration. And if indeed you see that very few of those beads have changed, you say, well, that looks like arguments, first of all, for creation, and second of all, arguments for a young Earth. And so they do that not just for human DNA, which Clyde was talking about, but they do it for fruit flies and fleas and roundworms and all sorts of things. In other words, if you didn't know there was a theory of evolution, and you were just looking at the DNA, in other words, you were a molecular biologist, Terry, you would say, there sure seems to be a lot more evidence for design, a lot more evidence for a recent creation, though a flawed one because mutations came about after the fall, we would believe. And so you would come to a conclusion that would be just the opposite of evolution. And you might say, why aren't more scientists coming out and saying, wait a minute, the evidence we have in our laboratory actually seems to contradict the theory of evolution. Terry, can you speak to why it's probably not a career-advancing move to, if you're in a public university, to come out and say that you have evidence for creation rather than evolution? Can you speak to that?
Well, yes. And in fact, in my introduction to this book, I referred to another book that had a paleontologist contribute a chapter, and his chapter was anonymous. And it was because he would probably suffer some serious professional difficulties if his colleagues at the academic institution knew that he had written the chapter. There's tremendous pressure in the scientific community to go along with what the majority thinks. And ultimately, this whole question of origins is spiritual in nature, because if there is a God who made the world and made man, and we are morally accountable to him, then we have some serious thinking to do about what he says about our sin problem and his solution, the Lord Jesus Christ. And if there is no God, then you can just live your life any way you want to. So there's a whole spiritual dimension to this that a lot of people want to deny and say, well, it's just science, but it's not really. And so it's a critical issue.
Certainly is. Let's see if we can get back to one that I did mention before the break, Neanderthals. You know, Terry, all sorts of people are saying, well, what about Neanderthal? But Marvin Lubenow spends some time helping us understand that once we really started looking at the fossil evidence, once we looked at the DNA evidence, we could honestly say that, you know, I don't think you are dealing with some kind of transitional form between the apes and humans. If anything, the cranial capacity of Neanderthals was larger than ours, so they may have been on the way down rather than the way up. Individuals that later got off the ark were an isolated population, but maybe even scientists today say that may have interbred with human beings, because I think we're talking about human beings, aren't we?
Oh, exactly. And Dr. Lubenow has been studying this issue for over 25 years, and particularly Neanderthals. And he shows that, you know, they had the gene for that's associated with human speech. They buried their dead ceremonially. They had controlled use of fire. There's even evidence that they had jewelry and used makeup, and they built boats and they built homes from animal skins. That all the archaeological evidence shows these are true humans. And interestingly, I was speaking in California a couple of years ago, and I gave a lecture on human origins, and a man came up to me afterwards and said, you need to use me in your talk in the future, and let me take his picture. And he's originally from Lithuania, and his DNA has been mapped, and he has 3% Neanderthal DNA. But he was not primitive. He worked in technical support for Google.
Yeah, if nothing else, I've always said that if you put a Neanderthal man in a suit, probably no one would pay attention to him unless it'd be a football recruiter. It looks like he'd make a great middle linebacker in terms of the way some of them were built. But other than that, let's, if we can, maybe answer before we run out of time here in this last half hour, this so what question. A lot of people say, well, it's really nice to know about Adam and Eve and all that. But there is a very significant concern that if you accept evolution, then you begin to, maybe like Darwin, accept the fact that there were superior races. So isn't it at least possible, and haven't we seen this in our culture, in our history, that sometimes evolution led to racism, evolution led to eugenics, and the idea of certain favored races? I know Dr. Jerry Bergman writes about that in your book, and it seems to me that there are some consequences to an evolutionary worldview, aren't there? Oh,
absolutely. Adolf Hitler was an evolutionist, and he applied that to his social solution, quote unquote, to the Jewish question. The communists are all evolutionists, and Joseph Stalin murdered more people in Russia than Hitler did. Mao Zedong and the Pol Pot regime were evolutionist-based communist systems that slaughtered millions. And as Dr. Bergman shows, the imperialistic moves of the Japanese in the Second World War were driven by evolutionist thinking. So this has been devastating. Now, we always want to quickly add that just because someone is an evolutionist doesn't mean he goes out and murders people.
Yeah.
But I know evolutionists who are really nice, upstanding citizens. But the evolutionary view, if you really begin to implement it in your thinking, in your worldview, in your application to politics and social relationships, it is devastating. And the same applies with Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood, And Charles Darwin's relative, I can't remember now, his nephew or whatever.
Francis Galton and some of those?
Yeah, was a eugenicist.
Right.
And so they advocated forced sterilization and, of course, the whole push to abort babies. And now, what we're seeing that the number of Down syndrome babies have been decreasing in number recently, and research has indicated it's because 90% of Down syndrome babies in the womb are aborted. So it's a serious problem.
And a lot of that's in Chapter 13 in the book. We'll come back and conclude our remarks right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A Nevada school district has reversed a long-standing policy just in time for its high school graduates to stick a feather in their cap. Students at the Washoe County School District have in the past been prevented from decorating their graduation caps. The policy prevented what we might call graduation graffiti, the inappropriate decorating of caps and gowns with vulgar language and even gang symbols. But in its zeal to protect the solemnity of the day, the policy prevented Native American students from decorating their cap with an eagle feather. Native Americans attach significant spiritual meaning to eagle feathers. The district's policy prevented Quecholi Nordwall's older sister from wearing a feather at graduation in 2014, and he was determined to make a difference this year. And it looks like that's just what happened. With the change in policy, the school district has, in fact, opened the graduation cap to decoration once more. The district could probably still prevent vulgar and lewd messages from appearing, but now, not only may Native American students adorn their caps with an eagle feather, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and other religious students should be able to decorate their caps with reference to their faith. This is how religious liberty encourages liberty, tolerance, and diversity. As one faith group's religious expression is protected, it means that those of other faiths benefit as well. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
For a few more minutes, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Although I suspect many of you just want to sit back and listen because there's so much good information in this book, Searching for Adam, Genesis, and the Truth About Man's Origin. I do teach a course every year at a Bible school on creation, and there are all sorts of things in some of these chapters I've never seen before. So a lot of great material, but we might take another phone call in just a minute. But one of the other questions, Terry, that people sometimes have is, well, if the Bible story is true, what about all these other, like, flood traditions and things like that, and creation traditions and things of that nature? Now, my argument is that the fact that we have so many stories about a flood and about individuals being saved on a boat or even a dugout canoe, depending on where you are in the world, And I think Tim Chafee, who works with you at Answers in Genesis there, has done a good job of showing that if indeed you sort of take the biblical account as true, which we do, then you can almost sort of see the story beginning to spread out from the biblical story, and why you find even in very remote parts of the world stories about people being saved in a dugout canoe in a flood, about there being a fall, about there being transgression, and those kinds of things. And so I think that's another very powerful argument. So what's oftentimes used as an argument against the Bible seems to me to be a very good argument for the truthfulness of the Bible, don't you think?
Yes, I do. And another important point related to that is that these stories are all over the world, and in cultures, they were found in cultures that had not had any contact with Jewish or with Christian missionaries. So the argument that, well, the missionaries brought these ideas in and then they were corrupted is just not consistent with the facts. And the fact that there are so many in diverse cultures does speak to the fact that it's reflecting a common human memory of actual events that are accurately recorded and preserved for us in the book of Genesis.
Let's take some more phone calls. We'll head first to South Carolina. WLPG Hugh, you're on with Dr. Terry Mortenson.
Thanks for the opportunity to ask a question of you and Dr. Mortenson. In Genesis 1, of course, 1 and 2, the comment about the earth being formless and void. Question for Dr. Mortenson, I'm not sure. I understood from my seminary training that verb was could also be translated became. And if that is true, and I need to check back with some of my Hebrew scholarly friends and pursue that, but in Isaiah 45:18, it says, for thus says the Lord God who created the heavens, he is God who formed the earth and made it. He established it and did not create it a waste place. And that word waste place, tohu, is the same Hebrew word that's used back in Genesis 1. There are two words in Genesis 1, tohu wabohu. And the fact that Isaiah says it was not created a waste place, Genesis 1 says it was or could be became a waste place. The question that I have is, when Satan was cast out into the earth, we understand obviously before the Garden of Eden scene, and thus, in my thinking, perhaps the darkness of physical and also symbolic that covered the earth, into which God brought light, of course, in the six-day creation process, in which I believe. If Satan was cast out since Satan was cast out into the earth, it seems to me that could have caused great catastrophic events on the globe, geological, etc., and something of magnitude that we could not even imagine, and that scientists could be only judging the appearance of age and not the real age. And if we have the ability to antique and make things look aged when they aren't, and lots of other things can be done. You bring pressure to coal and make diamonds, supposedly. I can't help but believe that Satan being cast out into the earth caused all sorts of calamities on the earth. And when Isaiah says that it was formed to be inhabited, that could it have been inhabitable at the moment of its creation? God had not yet made man, but it was made to be inhabited and was inhabitable, and Satan's being cast into the earth brought all sorts of destruction. If there were plants and animals on the earth that was inhabitable, then you've got possible coal and oil reserves already there, as well as the flood itself. So
only got a few minutes, so again, it deserves an entire program. But again, the fall of Satan and the issue of the appearance of age. Terry?
Yeah. Well, let me just say, if you look in English translations, they don't translate that Hebrew word became. It's always was. And the best book for you to read on that is a book by Weston Fields called Unformed and Unfilled. It's a very thorough critique of the gap theory. It's just biblically not defensible. And as far as the fall of Satan, I would encourage you to look at Ezekiel 28, which also refers to the fall of Satan. Most Bible scholars agree. And it clearly indicates that Satan was in the Garden of Eden in an unfallen state. So the fall of Satan could not have been before the sixth day. I don't believe it was on the seventh day because God sanctified it. And furthermore, there is no scripture that indicates that God judged the creation or judged the earth when Satan fell. Ezekiel 28 only says that he was cast down to the earth. So I think in Isaiah, when it says that God made the world to be inhabited, that's exactly what he was doing. And in verse 2, he's just describing the initial state of the earth before God formed it and filled it as he intended. So on our website, we have the Answers Book, Volume 1, which has a chapter on the gap theory, and you can read that online. The whole book is online, and or you can buy the book also in our bookstore. But Unformed and Unfilled is the definitive critique of the gap theory. It's just not consistent with the biblical text. As far as God creating appearance of age, of course he did. He created the plants with fruit already on their branches. He created the animals in a mature adult form because he commanded them to be fruitful and multiply. He created Adam and Eve not as fertilized eggs or little infants, but as adult forms also ready to reproduce. But the appearance of age argument is not a good argument to use to explain the fossil record. Rather, Noah's flood, we believe, is the cause of most of the geological record of rock layers and fossils. So that's some thoughts on the problem with the gap theory.
And one more point I might just mention, as you go to answersingenesis.org, their latest post here just came out today. Do varves, tree rings, and radiocarbon measurements prove an old Earth? So even as you go there and want to read some of the books, some of the blog posts there will be helpful as well. Well, Terry, it's just been a great program, and I really want to commend you and the other authors for this book, Searching for Adam, Genesis and the Truth About Man's Origin. I would imagine some people can find it in the local bookstore. It's published by Master Books, but if not, they can go to Answers in Genesis. We have a link there as well so that you can learn a little bit more about this issue, and you've done such a good job, and want to thank all the work that you do there at Answers in Genesis.
Well, great to be with you, Kerby. I appreciate your interest in the book and hope that it will be a great encouragement to God's people and a challenge to those who have maybe felt that they have to cave in to the pressure from the evangelical or from the evolutionist scientific majority.
Well, thank you, Terry Mortenson. And again, we've had Ken Ham and all sorts of other people from Answers in Genesis, great resources. And if you would like to know a little bit more about Answers in Genesis, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. We have a link there for you as well. And this is a very important issue, the issue of origins. And so we encourage you to investigate this as much as you possibly can. I'm going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking with Rod Gragg, My Brother's Keeper, Christians who risk all to protect Jewish targets from the Jewish Holocaust. Fascinating interview, but again, if you want to find out more about these interviews, go to our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after these important messages.
Point of View Radio has been changing lives for a generation. Listeners have been inspired to apply themselves in all kinds of ways, to stand up as lawyers defending the Constitution and freedom, to start Christian schools, training up a new generation, to launch ministries on college campuses, even to run for and serve in Congress. So again, what are you doing to make a positive change? One way to start today is to join the Truth Team, Truth Team 360, and help us change lives. Our nation needs a Truth Team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
As I mentioned this hour, we're going to do a book interview, and this is just an opportunity to encourage you to stand strong for your faith as we are going to spend some time talking about Christians who risk everything to protect Jewish targets during the Nazi Holocaust. And in order to really educate us on this, we go back to a historian that's been on the program with us a number of times before. Rod Gragg has been with us as we've talked about By the Hand of Providence, how faith shaped the American Revolution. We've also had him on fairly recently on the book The Pilgrim Chronicles, an eyewitness history of the Pilgrims and the founding of Plymouth Colony. This book is entitled My Brother's Keeper, Christians Who Risk All to Protect Jewish Targets of the Nazi Holocaust. Individual that serves as the director of the Crestcom Bank Center for Military and Veteran Studies at Coastal Carolina University. Many of his books have been selected by the Book of the Month Club, the History Club, the Military History Club as well. I mentioned a few of those, but some of the other ones, for example, Confederate Goliath, was one that certainly I remember, one that had to do with Gettysburg, just a whole series of books that you can find out more about. We have a link to his website, and most importantly, we have him now joining us by phone. So once again, Rod, thank you for joining us here on Point of View.
Well, hi, Kerby. Glad to be with you.
Just lots of studies that you've done over the years as you've looked at the Civil War. You, of course, have the Illustrated Gettysburg Reader and all sorts of others. And, of course, you've talked about the American Revolution and even the founding of the Pilgrims. This is a little different than what we sort of know you for, and that is you spent some time looking at more recent history. And what an incredible story, and I appreciate you doing this because, as you well know, if I were to go out with a microphone out in the street, or, matter of fact, I doubt anybody could give me a name of a Christian involved in protecting the Jewish individuals. But if I went into a church, maybe some people would know Corey Ten Boom or somebody like that. And of course, Chapter 16 is about the Ten Boom family. But you're going to hopefully today educate us about so many other Christians who risked their lives, their fortunes, their circumstances, their creature comforts, so that they could actually protect the Jews from the Nazi Holocaust. So how did you come about writing this particular book?
Well, that's a great question. I had done some work in the past on World War II topics, and I guess about more than 10 years ago, I was in Washington. I was at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C., and I saw a reference there to the righteous among the nation. Those are people that had been designated that way by Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem in the state of Israel,
right,
as people who were non-Jews who helped Jews during the Holocaust. And it made me think that there had to be some amazing history there and some really incredible stories. And I began to think about Christians who had been motivated by their faith to reach out and to risk themselves during the Holocaust. And also in recent years, I've been working on World War II projects in Europe, and I've been exposed to I think what is a rising concern in the Jewish community there of an increase in anti-Semitism. And so those things all kind of came together. And once I began looking into who some of these Christians were, who were the righteous among the nations, or included in the righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, the stories were just incredibly moving and important historically, and in so many cases very inspirational.
Well, again, and we can think of Another individual that people would know is not a Christian necessarily, but Oskar Schindler, who is one of those that is in that list. And, of course, I've been to the Holocaust Museum in Dallas. I've been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I've been to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem as well. And so this is something that I think is very important. And so let's maybe start with the more familiar, and that is, if I were to talk to older Christians, they would certainly remember the story of Corrie ten Boom, The Hiding Place, because of the book, because of the movie done by Billy Graham. More recently, we had the producer and director of the Return to the Hiding Place, another film to really kind of educate a whole next generation about this. But chapter 16 of your book talks about the ten Boom family. And we're talking about not only Corrie ten Boom, but Wilhelm and Betsy. So if you can, give us kind of an overview of their particular story and what they did in order to actually save the lives of many Jewish individuals.
Well, right, and that chapter in the book does profile the ten Boom family. Corrie, of course, is the most familiar to Christians because of her book, The Hiding Place, and other books she wrote, in the film that was made that you mentioned. But the entire family was actually involved in sheltering Jews in the city of Haarlem, which lay to the west of Amsterdam, and you can still go there today, and her house is preserved, and you can go through it and see the home. But the entire family was involved in sheltering Jews and also in assisting the Dutch resistance during the Nazi occupation of Holland. And the family was eventually caught. They had a place, a false wall that allowed Jewish visitors who were staying in their home, who they were hiding, or other members of the resistance who happened to be there, a place where they could go hide during a raid. And they were raided one day, and they did have Jews in the home, and they managed to get them into the hiding place, which is where that name came from. But the family was captured, and the patriarch of the family, Caspar ten Boom, died pretty soon. He was elderly, but he made this famous statement. He was given an opportunity to really have his freedom and not go to a concentration camp, but he made the statement that it would be an honor for me, he said, to give my life for God's ancient people. And he said to the Nazi officer that he would open his door to anyone in need. He didn't survive. Betsy didn't survive. Yeah. The sons of the family in other ways didn't survive the war. Corrie did, and her story really is extraordinary. Now, the ten Booms are known to a lot of Christians, and there's a couple of others here that are kind of known generally in the Holocaust literature, and that's one in particular, Jan Karski of Poland, and maybe a couple others. But most of the people in this book, there are 30 profiles of people and families, most of them are common, average people who have not been exposed for their faith and for their courage and so on. And yet their stories really, I think, as you move through this, kind of leap out at you. And
sure, I need to come to a break anyway, so let me just take a break right now, and we'll do that. I just mentioned, too, that one of the things that the father said is, I pity the Germans, they have touched the apple of God's eye. And, of course, that is one of his famous statements. But, of course, the other one that you just mentioned a minute ago, it would be an honor for me to give my life for God's ancient people. And so this is certainly one of the things that we want to spend some time talking about. And this is a book that I think would be a real encouragement to you as we talk about persecuted Christians around the world. And interestingly enough, this last year when they were talking about countries that persecute Christians, the United States ended up on the list. Now very far down the list, nothing like North Korea or China or anywhere else. But that's kind of intriguing. And matter of fact, one of the quotes comes from Kelly Shackelford, and I want to ask him about it on Friday. But let's take a break. If you would be interested in this book, we have given you all sorts of information about it, and it is entitled My Brother's Keeper. And it is a book that you certainly would want to find out more about. And so it is, again, a real incredible story of many Christians, which we'll be finding out about for the first time, who risk everything to protect these Jewish targets of the Nazi Holocaust. We'll have more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Sometimes the most important principles of a news story are the ones rarely mentioned. When we compare the death of Alfie Evans to Charlie Gard, we see the loss of parental control. And when we contrast his situation to the royal prince, we see the danger of socialized medicine. Over a week ago, the news dutifully reported that young Alfie Evans died because his parents were denied the opportunity to obtain treatment in Italy. Last year, it was Charlie Gard who was taken off life support by the British court system and prevented from seeking medical treatment in America. These two cases will become the precedent that confirms that the state, not the parents, have control of sick children. The British court system removed parental control and placed it in the hands of British bureaucrats. It is one thing when a government steps in when parents prevent children from receiving life-saving treatment. It is quite another when the government prevents parents from pursuing life-saving treatment for their child. Considering the contrast of the death of Alfie Evans with the birth of the prince. If the prince were born with some medical condition, don't you think that the royal family would do anything they could to save the child? It is hard to imagine the British court system getting involved at all. His treatment would be the exception. Alfie Evans and Charlie Gard are the rule. Sick children in a socialized medical system cannot be allowed to leave. Others might be ready to leave the system, and that would damage the system. And if any one of these sick children were cured, it would reflect badly on the medical experts and the British bureaucrats. So parents cannot be allowed to take their children to another country, even if the parents or the other country pay for it. During this political season, various candidates are talking about further government control of health care. We need to ask them if the stories of sick children in England illustrate what they're advocating for America. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation today with historian Rod Gragg as we talk about his book, My Brother's Keeper, a story really of 30 different Christian heroes who exhibited what many people call mind-boggling bravery in the midst of some of the threats from the Nazi Germans at that time, and certainly an incredibly powerful book. Over 300 pages. We have information about it on our website, and so you can get it in hardcover or Kindle. And so let me encourage you to do that, and we'll talk a bit more about maybe some of the other elements of the story. But if you'd like to join us at any point, I suspect this will be one where you'll kind of sit back and listen. But if you've got a comment or a question, we'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. Perhaps some of you have seen the movie, The Hiding Place, or the newer movie now, Return to the Hiding Place, which was sort of a prequel and tells you a little bit more about some of the individuals that were involved in that, and also takes you to the actual home where you can see some of that taking place. Or maybe you read the book or are familiar with Corrie ten Boom. I'd love to get your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Or else sit back and listen and hopefully pass these stories on to your children and grandchildren, because there is a time for Christians, especially when Christians are being persecuted around the world, and especially in some countries, for us to pray for those persecuted brothers and sisters. You mentioned another individual that we might know, Jan Karski. He is in Poland, but tell us that story as well, because there are some individuals, obviously, that we'll see, again, some of the parallels even as we look at what is happening in our world today.
Well, Jan Karski is kind of introduced early in the book because the book unfolds, follows the history of the Holocaust and actually the history of World War II in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And so you meet these people as you follow the unfolding of the war, or unfolding of the Holocaust, and then later the unfolding of the war Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and had made a deal with the Soviet Union. So Germany invaded from the west and the Soviet Union from the east, and they divided it. And Jan Karski was a Polish army officer who managed to escape both, and then found himself exposed to the incredible, the enormous amount of annihilation that was going on among the Jewish people. And we forget sometimes that there were almost as many Jewish people who were killed in killing fields as in concentration camps.
Right.
And just great numbers. One place, Baba Yar, 2 days, 35,000 people killed and buried in a giant pit.
Mm-hmm.
But Karski made it his mission to get word of this unfolding Holocaust out of Europe, and he wanted to take it to the government in Britain, and tried and didn't feel like he could get anyone to believe him, and so he went on to the United States, met with President Roosevelt, members of his cabinet and others, and felt at the time that he had failed, that he just had not been able to convince them that it was true and it was happening. And part of the problem was early on is that Western leaders just could not believe that a civilized, westernized country like Germany could be involved in the annihilation of a whole people. And the horrors were so great that people really had difficulty believing them. And he felt like he had failed, but actually he had gotten through and he'd made his point. And under Roosevelt, the United States eventually did begin to realize this was true and take some steps, and it was denounced in Great Britain in the same way. But Karski himself just had numerous escapes just trying to get this information out. He's probably one of the, I guess, of the few well-known folks in this book, along with the Tim Boones. Most of them, like I said, are common people, and they range from, a school teacher to a schoolgirl to pastors, priests, orphanage leaders. There's a diplomat, a British spy, a number of people, and the common element is that they were professing Christians who extended themselves and put themselves at risk to try to protect Jewish people during the Holocaust. And I think one who really was memorable, at least to me, was a German evangelical pastor in Berlin whose name was Heinrich Gruber. And he had friends in the Jewish community. When the Holocaust began, he interceded for them with Nazi officials and tried to protect them and defend them and help them in some cases get out of the country. And eventually a point came where he had this repeated contact with Adolf Eichmann, who was one of the architects of the Holocaust. And
he shared his faith with him, didn't he?
Well, that's just, I was really astounded when I found that.
Yes.
He did and recorded that. And he said that at one point as he was dealing with Eichmann said to him, "Why do you care? Why do you care about these Jews?
Mm-hmm.
You don't even know them." And then he began to share his faith and the fact that he worshipped and followed a Jewish Messiah, Yeshua Messiah, Jesus Christ, with Eichmann, who for once had nothing to say. Gruber himself was eventually sent to a concentration camp and had a heart attack and was thrown onto the day's pile of dead because they thought he had died. And then he recovered lying there among all the dead bodies. And some of his friends saw that he was alive and managed to get him out. And then kind of like Corrie ten Boom, he was surprisingly and miraculously released from the prison camp. And he went right back to trying to rescue Jews in Germany. So you've got a remarkable variety of people there. There's an entire village of people in France, predominantly Huguenot village. These were people, Christians, Protestant Reform believers who had a history in this village of helping refugees anyway, and the word got out that in this village, if you were Jewish, you could find help. And so increasing numbers of Jewish people began to make their way to this remote village, La Chambon-sur-le-Jean, which was in south-central France, and it was led by the whole movement was led by a Huguenot pastor named Andre Trocmé and his wife, and he would stand in the pulpit Sunday after Sunday, and he would announce that something like, we have 4 Old Testaments arriving tomorrow.
Yes.
And that was the code that Jews were coming, and someone would stand up in the congregation and say, I'll take those Bibles. And over a period of time, they managed to save more than 3,000 Jews during the Holocaust.
Yeah. Chapter 18 is a great story there as well. Of course, on D-Day, Allied forces landed there as well. Let me take a phone call as we move along as we are talking about this book, My Brother's Keeper. If you'd like to join us, we have Rod Gragg with us as we talk about his book. And we'll go to Texas. Redonda, KJRT, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, thank you. I appreciate y'all. Appreciate what y'all are doing in the daily broadcast. I've seen The Hiding Place and Schindler's List, and I'm also going into the medical field. And, there may be people in my life that I don't like, don't want nothing to do with, but, because I'm going in the medical field, I care about people even as just for the simple fact of humanity, because they're human. And I cannot comprehend or fathom how somebody can go around and try to annihilate.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Again, because all are created in the image of God, all have value and dignity. And this comes from the idea of there being a superior race. I mean, some of that goes all the way back to the subtitle of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, and then some of the eugenics movement. And you've got to get in Ludwig Feuerbach, and you've got to get in Nietzsche, and you've got to get all sorts of other things that eventually bring you to a point which, as you pointed out just a minute ago, Rod, one of the reasons why it was difficult to get the British or even the Americans to believe this is one of the most advanced countries in the world in the 1930s and 40s was Germany. So it seemed just incomprehensible that something like the Holocaust really would have been taking place.
Right, and this was one of the birthplaces of the Reformation, and the home of Martin Luther, and so I think, an incredible message there that if it could happen there, it could happen anywhere.
Let's take a break, and Redonda, thank you, and we wish you well in the medical career. When I come back, I want to talk a little bit more about how, in some respects, we need to give some credit to, for example, the United States, because you did have the War Refugee Board that did rescue some of those refugees. And then, of course, you also have the Nuremberg War Criminal Trials, which was, of course, too late for many of the Jews, but again, some of the justice that takes place, and some of that gets eliminated. So we want to talk about that and a couple of the other incredible stories. Of course, we've talked about one individual actually sharing his faith with the architect of the Holocaust, and that is Eichmann, but we also have some other incredible stories. And as he points out, I mean, we have Chinese and French and Polish and Dutch and all sorts of individuals that have been a part of this, and the commonality is their commitment to Jesus Christ. We'll continue our conversation talking about this book, My Brother's Keeper, right after these important messages.
A farmer will tell you that if you don't prepare the ground, if you never plant good seeds, don't expect a harvest. Weeds maybe, edible crop no. Achieving a positive result takes work and planning. If you're concerned about what's happening in our colleges, our marketplace, in the halls of government, let me ask, have you invested in pulling weeds and planting seeds? That's what the Truth Team at Point of View does. For decades, God has used this team to attack noxious mental weeds and to plant seeds of truth that have grown into changed lives. If you're already giving to this effort each month, we thank you. You share in the reward for what we harvest. If you're not, now is the time. $30, $65, $100. The more you invest on a regular basis, the more we'll reap together. Give online at pointofview.net or using the Point of View radio app, pointofview.net. Click at the top on Become a Monthly Partner or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Rod Gragg as we talk about his book, My Brother's Keeper. And as we mentioned just a few minutes ago, Yad Vashem, which is Israel's official memorial to the Holocaust, describes the Christians that are cited in this book, as well as some of the other members of what are called the righteous among the nations. That would be people like Oskar Schindler and others, as perhaps the sole rays of light in this dark era and the few whose consciousness prevented them from being indifferent. And this is a lesson we need to learn today. We cannot be indifferent to persecution of others, especially within the body of Christ, but all persecution. And so this is one of the reasons we wanted to cover this. And again, to educate you about a number of individuals you probably never have heard about. You might be familiar with Corrie ten Boom, but many of these others we're talking about today, Jan Karski, you might know as well. There are just so many that we'll talk about in this last half hour. And, of course, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. You know, while we mentioned Jan Karski, if nothing else, it seems to me that he did provide not only for the United States to rescue all sorts of Jewish refugees through the War Refugee Board, but also this led, as we had more and more information about what happened in the Holocaust, to the actual prosecution, I should say, of these various Nazi leaders and those who were sentenced to death. Some committed suicide. And even though that was too late for the Jews, it was a way in which the Western world could stand up and denounce what took place in Nazi Germany. And so that's another aspect of this whole conversation as well, isn't it?
Right, exactly. And while the Western leaders were slow to react to the Holocaust, partly because they just couldn't believe that anything that horrible could actually be happening, Karski had an influence, and to some credit, his reporting of what was really going on, what he had seen firsthand of the Holocaust, to the creation of what was known as the War Refugee Board, and eventually, over time, it was responsible for the rescue of more than 200,000 Jewish refugees. And also the United States, of course, being in the war, one of the war aims became to try to end the Holocaust, and American involvement in World War II in Europe is really what brought the war to an end. Winston Churchill said after the war that when England was left to face Nazi Germany alone for so long, after Hitler has defeated every other European adversary and occupied every country that he chose to invade, that Britain was left alone. And when Churchill heard that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, and forcing America to war with Japan, and then Hitler declared war on Germany because Germany was an ally of Japan, when Churchill heard that, he said he went to bed and slept a full night's sleep for the first time since the war had begun. And so American forces were greatly responsible for the defeat of Nazi Germany and ending the Holocaust. In this book also, there's, for instance, there's the story of an American soldier, Sergeant Roddy Edmonds, who was a 25-year-old American non-commissioned officer, was at the Battle of the Bulge, and his regiment was captured at the Bulge, and he was put in a German prisoner of war camp late 1944, and the German commandant called him forward and told him to assemble his troops, because he was the ranking officer in this particular camp in the American forces, and ordered him to identify the Jewish soldiers under his command, and he refused to do it. And
pointed a pistol at him, right? Yeah.
Well, he did. He assembled his entire American command and told the German commandant, "We are all Jews." And the officer pulled his sidearm and put it in his face and threatened to kill him, but he wouldn't budge, and saved a lot of Jewish lives at that point.
That's an incredible story, too. Let me take some phone calls along the way. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. I want to talk about some of the action of a Lutheran church there in Norway and Denmark that allowed for Jewish refugees to go to Sweden. But let's go back to the phones, first of all. And James in Georgia, thank you for calling today.
Hi, how are you doing today?
Very good. What would you like to add to our conversation?
what I would like your guest to speak on, during that time period before the Second World War and right on through the Second World War, you had a large anti-Semitic movement both here in America, across Europe, and a lot of other countries in the world. Now, they didn't go to the point of what Hitler and the Nazi Party did of mass murder, but they did support his thinking. Some of your industrialists right here in this country, one was a head of a car manufacturing in Detroit. He was anti-Semitic. The Germans actually were going to come over and give him the Iron Cross for supporting their anti-Semitic views. Has he read or anything on this information?
Sure. Rod?
Well, yeah, and I appreciate the point, and he's correct in what he says. And there was a rise of anti-Semitism, but that has been through the ages. There has been historically this recurring wave of anti-Semitism, and I think it goes back to what Casper ten Boom said, that the Jews are the apple of God's eye, and they certainly have been the targets through the ages. And there was a distressingly sizable movement of anti-Semitism in the Western world, in the United States, and throughout Europe, not just in Nazi Germany, but Hitler was the one who turned it into political policy in a major way, and who developed this whole scheme to take that and capitalize on that sin and turn it into a policy to annihilate the Jewish people. And 75 years ago this month, as a matter of fact, was the Wannsee Conference in Berlin, where Nazi leaders, following Hitler's direction, met at a kind of a villa, a guest house that the Nazis had in eastern Berlin, to set up a plan to try to put into practice what Hitler wanted to do in the annihilation of the Jews of Europe, and it became known as the final solution.
Final solution, yes.
And that was in January 75 years ago.
Incredible. Lots of stories in the book, but you talked about pastors in France. Let's talk about this pastor, Reverend Jensen, that read a letter to his congregation. And we're now talking about a Lutheran church, and we're talking about when, of course, you had the Nazis actually coming into Denmark and Norway. But this was, again, another opportunity, in this case for a Lutheran church, to actually save Jewish believers.
Right. Hitler took over Austria without firing a shot and incorporated it into Greater Germany. But he knew there would be bloodshed, and the Western leaders didn't stop him. And in 1939, he invaded Poland, and that triggered World War II. The United States didn't get into it until after Pearl Harbor, but in 1940, Hitler invaded Denmark, Norway, and everywhere that he went, Holland, everywhere he went, he began to implement persecution of the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
And in Denmark, he met with very little resistance, but in the end, once he began to persecute Jews, the Danes became fierce. And Denmark actually ended up having a record of probably preserving and saving more of its Jews proportionally than maybe any other country in Europe. Now, they had a much smaller population. But the village you're talking about was called Geology, and it was a little village on the coast and across a strait from Sweden. And the pastor of a Lutheran church there encouraged his people to take in Jews. And the word spread, and there was a railway that went there, and the trains started coming in, and they were packed with Jewish people. And they came in so quickly, so many, that they really had a hard time trying to house them. And they were trying to house them until they could put them on fishing boats and get them across the straits into Sweden. And they packed them into the church attic, put them in with members of the congregation, and then eventually the Germans raided the village and raided the church, and that chapter in the book deals with that and explains what happened to them and that incredible story.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about just a few concluding remarks. Again, there are so many stories, we can't possibly cover them in an hour, and that's why we have a link to this book, My Brother's Keeper, Christians Who Risk All to Protect Jewish Targets of the Nazi Holocaust. And you can get it both in hardback and in Kindle. 30 different stories of Christian heroes who really showed incredible bravery, sometimes with a gun pointed to their head, other times when they were taken off to various places where the Holocaust was taking place. So again, if you would like to know more about that, we have that on our website, pointofview.net. Rod Gragg is the author, 300 pages in the book, and we'll come back with some concluding remarks right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A Nevada school district has reversed a long-standing policy just in time for its high school graduates to stick a feather in their cap. Students at the Washoe County School District have in the past been prevented from decorating their graduation caps. The policy prevented what we might call graduation graffiti, the inappropriate decorating of caps and gowns with vulgar language and even gang symbols. But in its zeal to protect the solemnity of the day, the policy prevented Native American students from decorating their cap with an eagle feather. Native Americans attach significant spiritual meaning to eagle feathers. The district's policy prevented Quecholi Nordwall's older sister from wearing a feather at graduation in 2014, and he was determined to make a difference this year. And it looks like that's just what happened. With the change in policy, the school district has, in fact, opened the graduation cap to decoration once more. The district could probably still prevent vulgar and lewd messages from appearing, but now not only may Native American students adorn their caps with an eagle feather, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and other religious students should be able to decorate their caps with reference to their faith. This is how religious liberty encourages liberty, tolerance, and diversity. As one faith group's religious expression is protected, it means that those of other faiths benefit as well. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back with Rod Gragg for just a few more minutes as we talk about his book, My Brother's Keeper. And again, this is a book that I think you're going to find fascinating. And we were just talking just a minute ago about Pastor Jensen, who was in that Lutheran church there in Denmark. Or earlier we were talking about Pastor Trocmé, who was a pastor there in France. It does seem to me that even though there are a lot of people that are just ordinary individuals, we could learn a lesson that we might want to pass on to our pastors, and that is sometimes God is really calling for us to be bold from the pulpit and to really speak biblical truth to our congregation and to the culture, don't you think?
Well, without question, and you really do see that in a number of large portion of the folks who are cited here, where pastors, leaders who put their own lives at risk, and in some case gave them up to try to protect the Jews and to try to provide leadership for the Christian community and encouraging and inspiring them to do the right thing.
So again, just a great kind of diversity. Talk about that for just a minute, because you really have people from different walks of life. We have some that are Danish and French and Swedish and Dutch, but we have a Chinese individual. We have people from different countries, different denominations. Like I said, the one thing that kind of ties you together, of course, is their Christian commitment. But you have quite a diversity here among these 30 different stories that you tell.
Right. Well, and I'll just tell you three real quickly. Fang Shangho was a Chinese diplomat in Austria at the time of the takeover by Nazi Germany. He had been introduced to Christianity by Lutheran missionaries in China, and then found himself in 1938 in a position as the Chinese diplomat in Austria when it was taken over by the Nazis. And he began to issue visas to try to allow Jews to escape from Austria at a frantic pace, even though the Nazis and his own government tried to shut him down. And eventually, over a period of 2 years, he managed to save more than 12,000 Jews with his own efforts. There's also a German army officer. Surprisingly, you might think, a major named Max Leibke, who was anti-Nazi. He was a World War I veteran and opposed the Nazis and lost his job and was drafted into the Army and found himself in command of a garrison of the regular German Army, the Wehrmacht, in Poland, where there was a large concentration of Jewish people. And he learned that the SS, the Schutzstaffel, which was Hitler's private elite black uniformed troops who were in charge of the Holocaust, among other things, they were coming in a column to seize these Jews, and he barricaded a bridge and put machine guns on it and wouldn't let them through. And the SS commander was furious, and it was a standoff, but the SS officer backed down. And he came back eventually with, as you'd imagine, a vengeance. And Major Leike paid a huge price for that. But it was the only case I know of a regular German army officer who faced off the SS on behalf of the Jews. And then there's also the story here of a 13-year-old girl walking to church who meets a Jewish girl her age who's a slave laborer and befriends her and brings her food and assists her and helps her until one day her friend is gone, and she realizes she's gone to a death camp. But for a moment, there was that 13-year-old girl who was making the difference in the life of a persecuted little Jewish girl.
Wow. Just before we run out of time, any lessons that you maybe think we can learn from this incredible series of stories from My Brother's Keeper?
Well, good question. Yeah, I would say just in closing that the two things struck me in doing this book. One is I think that there's enormous potential darkness in the heart of all of us, and that's why we need a Savior. And then the other thing is you always ask yourself, would I have the courage to be able to stand up under a time such as this? And I think the answer I learned is that when that time comes, it's God who gives the grace.
Just incredible. Again, you wrote this because you were reading all these stories. Was this difficult for you to put together? Because even reading through it was hard. I can't even imagine what it must be like for you and what it was like for you to actually write this particular book.
Well, exactly. Great question. And one of the hardest things was how to take all this material and how to tell this story truthfully, accurately, and yet the reader can bear to read it. And, you know, I'm a military combat historian, and this is the only book that ever gave me nightmares.
Wow.
But it's also the book that has inspired me more than anything else I've ever read.
Let's just again mention some of the resources that are available through you. We've been privileged over the years to interview you a number of times. For example, By the Hand of Providence, How Faith Shaped the American Revolution. And, of course, we've talked with you about the Pilgrim Chronicles. I also, of course, mentioned a few of your other books, for example, the Illustrated Gettysburg Reader. But as people go to maybe your website or find some of the other resources that are available, it seems to me that there are just a number of books where we can learn some incredible lessons of our history. And that's something that I think we need to learn more about. So Can you point people to places where they can find some of these books? We do have a link, of course, to this one today on our website, My Brother's Keeper, but if people are interested in some of the other things you've been writing about, where would they find those?
Well, right. This book is published by the Hachette Book Group, which has a Hachette website, but the books you mentioned and others that I've written are available through Amazon.com and through online, for instance, with Walmart books online. And you just enter my name, Rod Gragg, in your favorite search engine, and hopefully there'll be a lot of books that'll pop up and direct you to different places where you can get them.
Well, Rod, we've appreciated you being on the program with us over these years, and thank you for writing this book and your previous books, and we look forward to the next opportunity.
Well, thanks. I appreciate what you do, and I appreciate the time that you've invested in this topic, and it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Again, the earlier books I would commend to you if you wanted to know a little bit more about how faith shaped the American Revolution. Just a fascinating book by the Hand of Providence. And, of course, I mentioned the Pilgrim Chronicles, an eyewitness history of the Pilgrims and founding of Plymouth Colony, something that we could read at any time, but especially around Thanksgiving. And then this book, My Brother's Keeper. If you maybe knew of Corrie ten Boom but did not know of the other 29 that are featured here, I would encourage you to get a copy of the book. It is possible that you could find it in your local bookstore, but most likely the easiest way is simply to go to our website, pointofview.net, and learn more about the Christians who risked really everything in order to protect Jewish believers. And so, again, this is something that we wanted to cover here on Point of View. And as you go to the website, let me just mention all sorts of resources that we have available for you today. We, of course, have 3 different interviews. So, again, you can find out about the interviews for those individuals on our website. And as you go there, you can certainly download some of the articles that we've posted. Let me just mention that my Viewpoints commentary is there as well, and I would encourage you to take the time to print that out and to read that, maybe even post it on your Facebook page or your Twitter page. And if you have not signed up to receive the Viewpoints commentaries, as I've mentioned before, you receive mine Monday through Friday, and Penedexter's on Saturday. So please take the time to sign it up. It's free, and it's just a way in which we can give you some additional information, oftentimes with some facts and figures and statistics, some of which we've covered on the radio program, others which we have not. And so all of that is available at the website pointofview.net. As you go there, don't forget that, of course, if you would like to hear any of these programs again, you can simply go to the website pointofview.net, click on the button that says Listen, download a podcast or watch, and you can watch it. Or, of course, you can go to the YouTube channel. Those are all resources we make available to you. And as you go to the website, I hope that you might consider clicking on that button that says Donate. That's a way in which you can help bring these programs to individuals on a regular basis. And so, again, we encourage your financial support. Need to take a break. When we come back this last hour, we'll be talking with Nonie Darwish. We'll be back right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
If you listen to Point of View, you know that we talk about Islam and oftentimes do a comparison of Islam to Christianity, and that's some of what we're going to be doing today. It is something that is difficult to do in this politically correct environment where we sort of just say that all values are relative. There's really no difference between religions, and as you will find out as we go through this conversation in this first hour today, there are striking differences between what the Bible teaches and what the Quran teaches, between what are the kind of standard Islamic values and Christian or biblical values. So this is certainly a very important topic and one that we're going to focus on for this first hour. We're going to bring back to the microphone here Nonie Darwish, a human rights activist, an individual that you perhaps best know her for when I think we interviewed her years and years ago on her book, Now They Call Me Infidel. Since then, of course, there have been all sorts of other excellent books that she has put together: Israel and the War on Terror, Cruel and Unusual Punishment, The Devil We Don't Know. But the focus today will be on this new book published by Regnery, Wholly Different: Why I Chose Biblical Values Over Islamic Values. And joining us now by phone, Nonie Darwish. Thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View.
My pleasure, Kerby. Thank you.
We have certainly followed your career over the years. Matter of fact, one of the people in our roundtable was Debbie Georgiadis. I think you actually did an interview with her on her radio show just the other day. And we have certainly watched you on videos. We've quoted from your books and articles and those kinds of things. But this one, I think, is perhaps one of the most important because it really helps us see the difference between biblical values and what the Bible teaches versus Islamic values and what the Quran teaches. And you've got some excellent charts that we're going to work our way through, and I would encourage some of our listeners, if they would like to teach in their classes about this, this is just an outstanding book to be able to begin to help people see the striking difference between those two worlds, a world, of course, you've been in both as a child and now as an adult, right?
Absolutely, and most Americans really consider Islam an Abrahamic religion. So they believe that they probably carry the same values, and if only terrorism is removed, then it should have no problems. But Islam is not does not have the values of the Bible. In fact, it's totally opposite to biblical values, and that is very important because the problem really is a lot more than just ISIS.
And again, one of the things you start the book with is there's been kind of a push to try to meld all these together under sort of Abrahamic religion. So that would be Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But early on, you take us into just something as simple as sin nature, and that is a remarkable difference. And whether Jesus died for you or whether you have to die for Allah. But for our listeners who maybe are not familiar with your testimony, talk a little bit about that transformation, because as an individual that lived in Cairo and Gaza, who had a father who was lieutenant general, talk about your, if you will, spiritual pilgrimage in that regard.
Yeah, I was born a Muslim, and I grew up in the war zone of Gaza. The mission of my father was to destroy Israel, and he was an Egyptian intelligence officer, high-ranking, and he died in the jihad against Israel. He was killed by Israel, and I blamed Israel because that's my country. Said that's what they told me. The president of Egypt came to pay condolences in our home, And I stood to greet him with my siblings, and he told us, which one of you kids will avenge your father's blood by killing Jews? And it felt very uncomfortable, this question, because I didn't want to kill anybody, but it made me feel that if I really love my father, then I must kill Jews. And that is the highest proof to Allah that I am worthy of going to heaven. There's no other way to go to heaven except by killing the enemies of Allah. Allah is very different from the God of the Bible. Allah has human enemies. While the Bible says we are not in a war with flesh and blood, Quran says Allah is in war with humans, and He calls them His enemies. And the job of Muslims is to go and kill those enemies. And that brings us to another difference, major difference, and that is that under Islam we must die for Allah. It's exactly the opposite to the Bible where Jesus died for us. Allah, we have to die for Him. That changes the whole dynamic of the relationship because Jesus came to save us. We didn't have to do anything. In Islam, we have to save Allah and Muhammad's reputation by killing his enemies on earth. Totally different perspective, totally different existence.
I might just mention for those of you that are listening, you might want to take some notes. I love making charts. Matter of fact, there's a joke going around that it wouldn't be a good Kerby Anderson talk without at least one chart. But just think about in your mind's eye a chart where on the left-hand side you have what the Bible teaches, and on the right-hand side what the Quran teaches. And we've already given you one, and that is, so there's actually 15 out of this book. We won't go over all of them.
Actually,
but
there are 55. They're at the very end. In the conclusion section. I started with 15.
Yes.
And I ended up the book
55.
with almost 60.
Yes, that's right. 53.
And counting.
Yeah.
And counting.
So again, we're not going to go through all 50 of those either, but and we won't even go through all 15 that you have in the beginning of the book. But on the left-hand side, put Jesus died for us, and on the right-hand side, we must die for Allah. And you can begin to create a chart. This book helps you do that. But one of the things I wanted to do, Nonie, is when we come back from the break, talk about what you talk about the sin factor, because that would be another one. Because the Bible teaches we are all sinners, but the Quran teaches they are all sinners, and that's a different kind of perspective. So then that's the difference between the confession of sin and the concealment of sin. And it's just a great illustration of, just apart from, as you mentioned just a minute ago, the concern over terrorism, which is a valid concern, there are just striking differences between the Bible and Quran. And if you've been watching some of the PBS specials lately, there has been such an attempt to try to blur any distinctions between the major religions, especially the distinction between Christianity and Islam. So that's why I think that you will really appreciate this book. It is entitled Wholly Different: Why I Chose Biblical Values Over Islamic Values. And it is published by Regnery, about 300 pages. And again, by the time you get to it, you end up really with 53 different differences, but we'll just talk about a few of those top 15 that are very helpful in terms of understanding the difference. This also really helps you, first of all, understand what a Muslim might be thinking, but it also will help you to be more effective in your evangelistic outreach. So let me commend this to you as an individual that may want to just study this on your own, but this also might be just a great study to have in your Sunday school class. For those of you that are pastors, you might even think about teaching and preaching out of some of this. And again, we are privileged to have with us the author of the book, Nonie Darwish. She is, again, a human rights activist, an individual that is a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy, director of the former Muslims United, and a recipient of the Claire Luce Policy Institute Award, to mention just a few. We'll come back and talk more about some of the things in her book right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Sometimes the most important principles of a news story are the ones rarely mentioned. When we compare the death of Alfie Evans to Charlie Gard, we see the loss of parental control. And when we contrast his situation to the royal prince, we see the danger of socialized medicine. Over a week ago, the news dutifully reported that young Alfie Evans died because his parents were denied the opportunity to obtain treatment in Italy. Last year, it was Charlie Gard who was taken off life support by the British court system and prevented from seeking medical treatment in America. These two cases will become the precedent that confirms that the state, not the parents, have control of sick children. The British court system removed parental control and placed it in the hands of British bureaucrats. It is one thing when a government steps in when parents prevent children from receiving life-saving treatment. It is quite another when the government prevents parents from pursuing life-saving treatment for their child. Considering the contrast of the death of Alfie Evans with the birth of the prince. If the prince were born with some medical condition, don't you think that the royal family would do anything they could to save the child? It is hard to imagine the British court system getting involved at all. His treatment would be the exception. Alfie Evans and Charlie Gard are the rule. Sick children in a socialized medical system cannot be allowed to leave. Others might be ready to leave the system, and that would damage the system. And if any one of these sick children were cured, it would reflect badly on the medical experts and the British bureaucrats. So parents cannot be allowed to take their children to another country, even if the parents or the other country pay for it. During this political season, various candidates are talking about further government control of health care. We need to ask them if the stories of sick children in England illustrate what they're advocating for America. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Join us with us today, Nonie Darwish, as we talk about her new book, Wholly Different, Why I Chose Biblical Values Over Islamic Values. And if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the stark differences between Christianity and really even Jewish and Christian views about sin and Islamic views has to do with this issue of who is a sinner and how you address it. And you, Nonie, talk about the difference between this idea that we are all sinners and they are sinners, the difference between judging the individual sin versus judging the sinner, the difference between the confession of sin and the concealment of sin. Talk about that, because there is really one of the most important watersheds, how Islam deals with sin compared to the way Jews and Christians deal with sin.
Absolutely. This is so prominent. When I came to America and I attended church for the first time, I was shocked at the concept of we're all sinners. In fact, it made me feel so comforted. It was comforting because it felt like we're really human and we all sin equally. But this is so opposite to what Islam talks about sin. Islam looks at sin like collectively, like they are sinners. The outside world is sinners. Jews and Christians. It's somewhere out there. It doesn't look at it within like Christianity and, the biblical values. And I remember when I was a child in my, Islamic studies classes, I was told Jews and Christians admitted their sin in their Bible. And that is why Islam came to show them the way, because they keep admitting they are sinners. So just the fact that Jews and Christians talk about their sin and about redemption and about being better people, self-control, looking within, all of this is used by Islam as a weapon against Jews and Christians. Muhammad totally did not understand the Bible. He, instead of appreciating, admitting sin and asking for forgiveness and cleansing oneself from sin, he really regarded it as an admission of being evil.
Mm-hmm.
And that is why he has assigned the job of fixing Jews and Christians to Muslims. We are supposed to fix Jews and Christians to make them stop sinning.
And also there's a sense of weakness, too, because I've looked in the prisons, I've written about this as well, and oftentimes what they'll say is, well, Christianity is for weak people that have to admit that they've got weakness, they've got sins, but you're a strong person, and you don't have to accept all of that. And so it's also an evangelistic technique that says that because you admit that you're a sinner, you're really a weak person, and you're really a strong person, you can actually deal with this yourself. You don't need someone else to help you.
It's a sign of strength, and also it's a sign of a culture that is accepting of second chances. Because in Islam, if you admit your sin, your head is chopped. It's different. And also there are, Muhammad has a lot of hadiths. Hadiths are sayings by Muhammad, in which he tells Muslims, he commands them to conceal your sin.
Yep, conceal.
Is conceal your sin. Can you believe the guilt that Muslims are walking around with? And at the same time, they have to dump it on Jews and Christians. Now, this might explain why all this anger and hatred that the West doesn't understand. And they really think that Muslims are just misunderstanding their religion. And it's not. They are fully understanding it. They cannot even talk about their own sin. All they can talk about is the sin of others. And not only is Muhammad allowing to conceal sin, but when non-Muslims started criticizing Muhammad for having committed a lot of what we in the Bible call sin, like murder, Muhammad has murdered with his own hands. He killed. He took sexual slaves. He was involved in many aggressive wars, offensive wars, battles, and he took the property of others that he killed. And also, he married a girl who was 6 years old when he was 52. And he consummated the marriage when she was 9. So by all standards, even by Arabian Peninsula standards at the time, this was not holy. So Muhammad and Islam created another theory for sin, which is immunity from sin. In Arabic, it's called ma'soom. Muhammad has immunity from sin. The top sheikhs are immunity from sin. And because you created this theory of immunity from sin, most Arab and Muslim leaders call themselves, we are immune from sin. So you are living in a society where the top people feel entitled to sin and nobody should criticize them. And that is horrendous. When Muhammad gave himself and his top followers immunity from sin, the caliphs are all immune from sin. So he has hurt his community because he did not live a life that he's preaching. For instance, he was preaching only up to 4 wives for men. Now, and he had 11.
Mm-hmm.
So that he's immune from sin. He's above the law. And that's why there is lawlessness wherever you go in the Muslim world. Everybody wants to be like Muhammad, immune from sin. So who are the bad people? The Christians and the Jews. What a recipe for disaster. And that is why when Jesus, I saw the character of Jesus, and he applied to himself as when he was living among people, he applied everything he preached to himself. And that is a major difference between the Bible, biblical values, and Islamic values.
So again, we've looked at, we are all sinners, they are sinners, the idea of judging the sin, judging the sinner. Let's, before we take a break, talk about one other, and that is the issue of truth. The Bible teaches the truth will set you free, but you also talk about how in Islam, lying and deception is actually an obligation. Explain that if you might.
Absolutely. The truth is talked about in the Bible. It's all over the Bible. And that was one of the things that really impressed me in the Bible. And this is at the time, the Bible came over 2,000 years ago to people who were wanting to survive, let alone just live by the truth. Because if you live by the truth, you have to have society that allows truth, speaking the truth. But I lived under Islam in a society that did not allow speaking the truth. And if you speak the truth in an Islamic society, your head will be chopped, most probably. So when you live in a biblical-based society, speaking the truth is something encouraged, and it's a value. It will set you free. But in order to speak the truth, to be set free, you have to have biblical people who value biblical values. And that's one thing that the West really need to understand, the miracle of the Bible, that it gave us a society that allow us to speak the truth. Because under Islam, not only lying is an obligation, but slander is an obligation if it's good for Islam. So you have to lie. Actually, one of the reasons I'm shunned them under a death sentence under Islam is because I am telling the West, I am telling the sinner West the truth about Islam.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue talking about these very important principles. And again, it's almost like you can create a chart either in your mind's eye or even for a presentation to talk about what the Bible teaches, what the Quran teaches. And it's all part of this new book, Wholly Different: Why I Chose Biblical Values Over Islamic Values. And if you'd like to know more about Nonie Darwish, first of all, we have a link to her website, noniedarwish.org. You don't even need to know how to spell it because we have a link there. We also have information about the book. You probably can find it in your local bookstore, but if you would like to order it, we have it both in hardback and Kindle that you can get, and we have some of those links on our website as well. We'll continue our conversation and look at the comparisons between biblical values and Islamic values. All that coming up right after this.
When listeners call in, we never know what they're going to say, and sometimes they shock us, like Jacob did.
We as Christians, we should learn to support ministries like yours that is reaching out and shining light into darkness. This is why Satan has such a great grip on America and the world, is because the world support their own. They will spend billions of dollars to make sure they are heard. The Lord is working a great work through Point of View.
We are thankful for listeners like Jacob and you who become part of our family, a real part, by sacrificing to support the work of Point of View. Take Jacob's words to heart and support us today. Enable us to continue shining God's light into the darkness. We honestly cannot do it without you. Visit pointofview.net. Look for the Donate Now button or call 800-347-5151 or send a gift to Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with Nonie Darwish. And if you'd like to join our conversation as we're doing a comparison between biblical values and Islamic values, 1-800-351-1212. The book is entitled Wholly Different, Why I Chose Biblical Values Over Islamic Values. It is published by Regnery, and you can find it in your local bookstore. But we also have a link, and we also, of course, have a link to her website as well, noniedarwish.com. Nonie, we talked about the difference between, the truth will set you free and lying and even slander is an obligation. But let me come back to that word freedom, because you have a whole chapter here, freedom in the Bible and freedom in Islam. The terms are the same, but the meanings are very, very different, because you have a father-son, father-daughter relationship in the Bible, but you have kind of a master-slave relationship in the Quran, don't you?
Absolutely. In the Bible, we're called children of God. In Islam, we are slaves of Allah. We don't look at, when I was a Muslim, I did not look at Allah as my father. He was a distant deity who only wanted to fight his enemies if he's going to send us to heaven. And heaven was a very different heaven from, the biblical heaven. It was full of lure, of sensual lure and fleshly pleasures, especially for men. And so it's, very totally different. The truth in the Bible is basic. In Islam, the God of Islam wants us to be his slaves. He wants us to conform to humans around us, to what humans, we have to, humans are given the authority to punish other humans under Islamic law. So the God of Islam, actually, he delegated his authority to humans to punish other humans. And that is what's called terrorism in Islam. The God of Islam uses fear by human against other humans who are supposed to be his slaves. A very different concept from the God of the Bible.
Certainly. One of the chapters in your book is the biblical values that changed me. And as I turned the page, it was striking because the difference between praising and cursing, the difference between a personal prayer and an exhibitionist prayer, some of the others you talked about, prayers for everyone versus prayers just for Muslims, vengeance is the Lord's versus vengeance is prescribed. Those were some things that were attractive to you, to Christianity, and I think are maybe some ways we can equip our listeners as they talk to their Muslim friends about what might attract them to the truthfulness of the gospel.
Absolutely, and the concept of love, too. Love was never mentioned in the Quran. The concept of love does not even exist in Islam. Nobody talks about love. We talk about vengeance. We talk about jihad, conquering the earth to Allah, sacrificing the whole family for Allah. So God wants us to sacrifice ourselves by killing his enemies on earth. Very different godliness, kind of a godliness. God wants us in the Bible to have life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. In Islam, laughing and having joy. The Bible mentions the word joy. Mm-hmm. I was shocked when I heard the word joy in the Bible. God wants us to have joy. Wow! In Islam, they beat people who sing or have fun. Even it's a totally different concept of life.
Certainly. Talk about prayer for just a minute, because this is one where Christians look at this and say, okay, they pray 5 times a day, they face towards Mecca, they look very devoted, but it's very different kind of prayer. For a Christian, prayer is having, actual conversation with your Heavenly Father, whereas for a Muslim, prayer is a rote activity. Explain that, if you might.
Actually, Islam forces people to pray, and you have to say certain words when you're praying. You don't communicate to God freely, and it's more of an exhibitionist prayer.
Mm-hmm.
It's done as a show of power, and you see Muslims love to pray on the street. And I've shown in my book a lot of examples. They even want to pray in an airplane, say Allahu Akbar, and that is scary for some. They go into events, public events. They block whole streets in Paris, in Europe. They block the street and make people stop their cars in order for them to pray. So it is a show of power.
Wow.
Islamic prayers are a show
of power. Yeah, show of power.
In Egypt, I remember Christians during the Friday prayer used to be scared to walk near a mosque or near a blocked street, because sometimes the sheikh, who is supposed to be like equivalent to the Christian pastor, he would say, "Go kill the infidels." So they come out of the mosque ready to hurt non-Muslims. So it's a show of power, and there was, if you go to YouTube, you'll find a video of a girl with lots of makeup. She goes on corners in New York and just spreads her rug and starts praying. And people were looking very strange. What is this? She was trying to have someone tell her something so she can prove to America that they are Islamophobes. Look at these silly Americans. They don't understand that I have the right to pray on the street corner, and her friend was following her with a camera. So the purpose of prayers is more of intimidation of others than a personal relationship with God.
Fascinating. Let me take one more before we take another break, and that has to do with the fact that you're a human rights activist, and you make a real distinction between the difference between a Judeo-Christian foundation, which upholds human rights and gives you the freedom of religion and speech, and the idea that all are created equal, those kinds of ideas which are really foundational to Western culture, versus sacrificing human rights. And there is a real stark difference on human rights, aren't there, in terms of the Bible and the Quran?
Absolutely. Islam is the only religion on earth that kills anybody who leaves it. And also, being a Muslim is not by choice. When I was born, my birth certificate was stamped Muslim. And whether my parents wanted it or not, it's a relationship with the state. Being a Muslim is a relationship with the state. And if you leave Islam, the state has to kill you because it's considered a crime against the state. And that is very different. That is not religion, according to Western definition of religion. A religion is not supposed to kill you if you leave it. And that is the big problem to solve for the West, who is condemning anybody who says, let's vet Muslims before they come to America, because they regard it as a religion.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Nonie Darwish. If you'd like to join us, let's open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212, as we are talking today about her new book, Wholly Different, Why I Chose Biblical Values Over Islamic Values. We'll come back and talk a little bit about feminism in particular, because there is a real difference between a biblical view of women, a secular view of women, and an Islamic view of women. And then her last chapter is My Kingdom is Not of This World versus Islam and the Caliphate, and in particular, Islam, a rebellion against the Bible. Just a couple of other great pieces of material in this book. There are so much more that we haven't had a chance to cover, but if you would like to know a little bit more, you can visit our website, pointofview.net. If you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll take your calls on Islam right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. A Nevada school district has reversed a long-standing policy just in time for its high school graduates to stick a feather in their cap. Students at the Washoe County School District have in the past been prevented from decorating their graduation caps. The policy prevented what we might call graduation graffiti, the inappropriate decorating of caps and gowns with vulgar language and even gang symbols. But in its zeal to protect the solemnity of the day, the policy prevented Native American students from decorating their cap with an eagle feather. Native Americans attach significant spiritual meaning to eagle feathers. The district's policy prevented Quecholi Nordwall's older sister from wearing a feather at graduation in 2014, and he was determined to make a difference this year. And it looks like that's just what happened. With the change in policy, the school district has, in fact, opened the graduation cap to decoration once more. The district could probably still prevent vulgar and lewd messages from appearing, but now not only may Native American students adorn their caps with an eagle feather, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and other religious students should be able to decorate their caps with reference to their faith. This is how religious liberty encourages liberty, tolerance, and diversity. As one faith group's religious expression is protected, it means that those of other faiths benefit as well. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Guide at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Nonie Darwish with us for a few more minutes as we talk about her book, Wholly Different, Why I Chose Biblical Values Over Islamic Values. And I thought we'd talk about feminism for just a minute because Ayaan Hirsi Ali has a Prager University video right now, Why Don't Feminists Fight for Muslim Women? And the plight of women in the Muslim world is not the same as the plight of women and the status of women in the Western world. So what are the differences in feminism between, say, a Christian view or a biblical view, a secular view, and an Islamic view?
Well, to put it in a nutshell, secular feminists in America are anti-Bible. And they started in the 60s as a rebellion against biblical values regarding the role of women in marriage and what the priorities of women are. And Islamic values regarding feminism are very different. In Islam, women who call themselves feminists are very pro-Sharia. They wear their hijab with pride. They report on the bad girls who don't want to wear their hijab and head cover. And they stand in front of the cameras and say, we're going to give our sons and daughters to jihad. I am proud of my husband died in the jihad. And these are the women who are promoted as honorable, good women and rewarded with good positions, good salaries in the Middle East. And they are the ones who are sent to American college campuses by Saudi Arabia to represent Islam and to promote that Sharia is not against women, then it's wonderful. And the leftist secular feminists in America embrace them. Who are the true feminists in the West? These are the women, the Christian women. I believe Christianity was the first movement, the first true feminist movement, because they gave women, at a time when women were a commodity, used, polygamy, men had no regard for loyalty to one wife. And the Bible came and revolutionized the relationship between a man and a woman and made it one flesh. I believe that Jesus brought us the first feminist movement ever for the benefit of women, and actually limited men from being polygamous to being loyal to one wife. Islam came 600 years after Jesus, after the Bible, as a rebellion against biblical values, as a rebellion against one man, one woman, a marriage. Islam is very similar to now to the values of the liberal, progressive, anti-marriage left. In that sense, really, Islam came as a rebellion against the biblical family unit. And in the Muslim marriage contract, for instance, it's a little different from the secularists, but it says, please name an address of wife number 1, wife number 2, and wife number 3, if any. That's a question in the Islamic marriage contract in Egypt.
Wow.
And the man does not vow loyalty in the marriage to the wife. It's only the wife that vows loyalty to the man. That's very different.
Yes.
And in that sense, secularists in America and progressives who hate the biblical values of marriage and are on their way to wanting to destroy and eliminate any differences between the sexes, they find Islam more attractive than the Bible.
Wow. Let's take some phone calls. We'll go to Ohio first, WSEW. Dan, thank you for joining us. You're on with Nonie Darwish.
Hello, Nonie. Interesting you should talk about feminism. It kind of ties in with my question. I was wondering if you believe, is there a formal or informal alliance between the left and Islam? Every time an Islamic person is offended, the media blows it way out of proportion, or anything against Islam is treated as horrible, where Christianity is mocked and scorned by our media. You know, they claim to be for gays, but they ignore the fact of Islam being radically against the gay rights. And it seems like,
exactly. It's very frustrating that the left in America and the media and actually the Democratic Party has become the party of Islam. It's amazing how much they defend Islam and put down biblical values. And I believe that 600 years after the Bible, Islam came as a rebellion against biblical values and against the Ten Commandments. And today we have a rebellion against the Bible in the West in a much very similar to the Islamic rebellion against the Bible. And we have to look at it from that angle. It's very sad because the left, that supposedly stands for free speech and freedom of religion and women's rights, they are embracing Islam. And when they attacked when the terrorists in Florida attacked the gay nightclub and killed 50 gay people, they just hushed it. They didn't want to say it was a Muslim who did that. And that makes me really doubt if secularists in America even care about gays as they claim.
Well, again, your book has a whole section, as you just alluded to, on a rebellion against the Ten Commandments, of course, a rebellion against the Bible, sections on feminism, which we just talked about briefly, the family, and much more. But just before we run out of time, let's talk about what is on your website, because, Nonie, we have a link to your website, noniedarwish.org, and it's a great place for all sorts of articles that you've written. So talk about what they will find when they land on your website.
Well, if they want to contact me, they can contact me through my website or Facebook. I'm on Facebook and Twitter under Nonie Darwish. And I have regular articles published. And if they have any questions, so please contact me. I'll be very happy to explain, because I really want the American people to understand what's at stake. And it's a lot more than ISIS.
Well, it certainly is. And again, we do have on our website a link to your Twitter account, your Facebook account, the website, as well as information about the book and all the rest. So, Nonie, we certainly appreciate the work that you've done over the years, starting with, of course, Now They Call Me Infidel, and all the way up to this new book, Wholly Different, Why I Chose Biblical Values Over Islamic Values.
Yeah, quick. My book also comes in an audio version and in a CD version. So if somebody drives a long distance and they want the CD or want to listen, and I have narrated the book.
Very good, and we appreciate you providing that for us today. Just before we run out of time, let me just mention that if you would like to know more about some of these books that we have done the interviews on today, they are available at the website pointofview.net. If you'd like to listen to them again, you can click on that button that says listen or even watch, and that's a way in which you can review it or even benefit by sending that to someone else who would benefit from these resources. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information.